The station, called Athenaeum Primus, floated in the dead space between two burned-out stars like a cathedral someone had forgotten to tear down. And Cale Maddox hated it the moment he stepped off the transport shuttle. He was not the kind of man who belonged in places like this. Places built for silence and reverence and the careful study of things no one was allowed to touch. And yet here he was, carrying a duffel bag full of hand tools and wearing a jacket still stained with carbon scoring from his last restoration job on a decommissioned Earth battleship. The docking officer, a tall and impossibly thin alien of a species Cale did not recognize, stared at him for a full 10 seconds before scanning his credentials and waving him through without a word. Cale walked through corridors lined with glass cases that held the treasures of 100 civilizations, fragments of ancient ships, ceremonial blades sealed in gas-filled chambers, tablets covered in languages that had been dead for longer than humanity had existed, and he did not stop to look at any of them, because he had learned a long time ago that museums made him restless. He had been summoned by the conclave of elder species, which was the kind of title that sounded impressive until you met the beings behind it and realized they were mostly just very old and very tired, and very afraid of making decisions that anyone might remember them for. The message had arrived on his personal terminal 3 weeks ago, encrypted with a security protocol he had never seen before, and it had said only this: "Your expertise is required for a matter of cultural preservation. Transport will be arranged, compensation will be generous, discretion is mandatory." Cale had almost deleted it, because messages like that usually meant someone wanted him to fake the provenance of a stolen artifact. But then he had noticed the conclave seal at the bottom of the transmission, and curiosity had won the day. Way it always did. Now he stood in the entrance hall of the Grand Archive, and waited while a floating drone guided him toward the conclave's meeting chamber, which turned out to be a massive circular room with 12 elevated platforms arranged around a central floor, each one occupied by a representative of one of the galaxy's oldest surviving species. The Valith representative sat on the platform directly ahead of him, an insectoid being roughly 2 meters tall, with a segmented body covered in plates of deep indigo chitin that clicked softly whenever it moved, and it watched Cale with compound eyes that reflected the light in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was actually looking. The chamber was silent in a way that felt intentional, the kind of silence designed to make the person standing in the middle of the room feel very small. And Cale recognized the tactic immediately, because human generals had been using it for thousands of years. "The human metallurgist," said the Valith representative, and its voice came through a translator unit that turned the clicks and hisses of its natural speech into flat and toneless English. "I am," Cale said, and he set his duffel bag on the floor with a deliberate thud that echoed through the chamber because he was not in the mood to feel small. The Valith representative, whose name, Cale would later learn, was Archivulus Suyen, gestured with one of its 4 upper limbs toward a sealed container that sat on a pedestal in the center of the room. And the container opened with a hiss of escaping atmosphere that smelled like old copper and something else that Cale could not immediately name, but that made the hair on his arms stand up. Inside the container lay the shattered remains of a suit of armor. It was not like any armor Cale had ever seen, and he had seen a great deal of armor in his career. Roman lorica, samurai yoroi, powered exoskeletons from the Third Solar War, because armor was his specialty and had been since he was 19 years old, and rebuilding museum pieces in the basement of the Smithsonian. This armor was alive, or it had been once. He could see it in the way the plates curved and interlocked with an organic precision that no machine could replicate. And it was old in a way that made his breath catch, because the corrosion patterns told him this thing had been sitting in its container for tens of thousands of years. The blood was the first thing he noticed after the shape. It was everywhere, dried to a black crust that filled the joints and seams, and covered the interior surfaces in a layer so thick it had become part of the structure. And Cale understood immediately that whoever had worn this armor last had died in it, and had never been removed from it, and that the armor had simply been sealed away with the wearer's remains still fused into the metal. "This is Rakthun battle armor," said, and something in the translator's flat tone shifted in a way that suggested the words carried enormous weight in the original language. "It was worn by the general known as Vreth the Undying in the final battle of our species' last war, and it is the only surviving example of its kind." Cale crouched beside the container and studied the armor without touching it, because he knew better than to put his hands on a 40,000-year-old artifact without gloves, and he let his eyes trace the fracture lines and impact craters and the places where the metal had been bent inward by forces that must have been tremendous. "Why me?" he asked, without looking up. "Because we cannot do it ourselves," Suian said, and the admission cost the archivalist something. Cale could hear it even through the translator. "We abandoned the knowledge of war and all its crafts many thousands of years ago, and there is no one among our people who understands how this armor was made or how it might be restored. And humans do. Humans are the only species in the known galaxy that still teach its children how to forge weapons and read battlefields and remember the names of soldiers," Suian said. And it was not a compliment, and it was not an insult. It was simply a fact, delivered with the careful neutrality of someone who found the fact deeply unsettling. Cale stood up and looked at the armor for a long time, and then he looked at Suian, and then he looked at the 11 other representatives sitting on their elevated platforms in their careful silence. And he asked the question that he already knew would change everything. "Do you want the clean version," he said, "or the one with the blood still on it?" The chamber went so quiet that Cale could hear the hum of the station's life support systems 3 decks away, and Suian's compound eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made the translator crackle. "We do not know," archivalist said at last, and the honesty in those 4 words was the most frightening thing Cale had heard in a very long time. "That is why we called you." Cale picked up his duffel bag and slung it over his shoulder, and nodded once. "Then I guess we figure it out together." They gave him a sealed laboratory deep inside the station, where the air was filtered 9 times before it reached his lungs, and the temperature held steady at a level that would keep the ancient metal from expanding or contracting, even a fraction of a millimeter. And Cale spent the first 3 days doing nothing but looking. He did not touch the armor during those 3 days. He circled it, and he photographed it, and he ran passive scans that mapped its surface down to the molecular level. Because rushing was how you destroyed things that could never be replaced, and Cale had not built his reputation by being careless. On the 4th day he put on his gloves and lifted the first plate. It came apart in his hands like the page of a book that had been left in the rain for a century. And underneath it he found something that made him sit down on the cold floor of the laboratory and stare at the ceiling for a long time. The armor was not metal, or rather, it was not only metal, because woven into the alloy at a level so fine that his initial scans had missed it entirely, was a biological matrix of proteins and mineral compounds that matched no known material in any galactic database, and the structure of this matrix told him that the armor had been grown rather than forged. It had been grown from the body of the person who wore it. Cale called Dr. Lean Hoshida on a secure channel that same evening, and she answered from her office at the University of Kyoto, where it was 3 in the morning, and she was still awake, because she was the kind of person who forgot that sleep existed when she was working on a translation. "I need you to look at something," he said, and he sent her the images of the inscriptions he had found on the interior surfaces of the chest plate. Lines of text carved into the metal in a script that was angular and dense, and unlike anything the modern Violet used. Lean was quiet for almost a full minute after receiving the images, and then she said, "Kale, this is old Valith battle script. This dialect has been dead for 30,000 years, and I have maybe 40 reference texts to work with. Give me a week." "You have 3 days," he said. "I hate you," she said, and then she hung up, and he knew she would have it done in 2. While Lean worked on the translations, Kale continued disassembling the armor layer by layer with the patience of a man defusing a bomb, and every layer taught him something new and terrible about the species that had built it. The outer plates were designed to shatter on impact and reform, a self-healing system powered by the biological matrix that would have drawn energy directly from the wearer's metabolism, which meant that wearing this armor in battle would have been slowly killing the person inside it with every hit they absorbed. The joint assemblies were engineered to amplify the wearer's natural movements by a factor of 3, but the stress patterns in the connectors showed that this amplification came at a cost. Micro-fractures in the places where the armor bonded to the wearer's body that would have caused constant and increasing pain over time. And the blood, the dried black crust that filled every gap and seam and crevice, was not contamination and was not an accident of history, but was in fact a structural component, because the biological matrix needed a continuous supply of the wearer's blood to maintain its molecular bonds, and removing it would cause the entire structure to lose cohesion and crumble like ash. The armor had been designed to eat its wearer alive, and Vreth the Undying had worn it anyway. Kale was still processing this when the first visitor arrived at his laboratory. The Dremori representative, a being that looked like someone had taken a dinosaur and taught it philosophy. 4 meters tall, with scales the color of old bronze, and eyes that held a terrible and ancient intelligence, stood at the observation window and watched Kale work for 2 hours without saying a word, before finally speaking through the intercom. "You handle the pieces as though they matter," the Dremori said, and its voice was deep enough to vibrate the glass. "They do matter," Kale said without looking up. "To you, perhaps. Many on the conclave believe this project should be stopped before it is finished." Kale set down the gauntlet he was examining and turned to face the window, and the Dremori looked down at him with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been pity. "The Quellan have formally objected," the Dremori continued. "They say the armor radiates what they call a frequency of suffering. Their empathic senses find it disturbing. And the Asuri have begun circulating a petition to have the artifact classified as a weapon and destroyed under the Galactic Peace Accords." "It is not a weapon anymore." "That depends on how you define weapon," the Dremori replied. And then it left, and Kale stood alone in his laboratory, surrounded by the broken bones of an armor that had killed the hero who wore it, and wondered not for the first time what exactly he had agreed to do. Leon called him the next morning with the translations, and her voice was strange, in a way that Kale had never heard before. Not excited the way she usually was when she cracked a difficult text, but quiet and careful in the way people get when they have found something that has changed the way they see the world. "The inscriptions on the interior plates are prayers," she said, "but they are not prayers for victory, and they are not prayers for strength in battle." "What are they prayers for?" Kale asked. "They are prayers for the war to end," Leon said, and she read him the closest translation she could manage. "Let my hands remember how to build. Let my eyes remember how to see without. Searching for threats, let my heart remember that it was not always this hard. Let this armor be the last thing I wear before I learn how to be something other than a soldier." Kale sat with those words for a very long time after the call ended, and he looked at the armor spread out across his work table, the shattered plates and the cracked joints and the blood that held it all together. And he understood something that the Valith had forgotten, and that the Conclave had never known. Vreth had not been a monster who loved war. Vreth had been a person trapped inside a machine that was eating them alive, praying every single day for the chance to take it off. The Conclave held an emergency session that evening to discuss the growing opposition to the restoration, and Kale was summoned to explain why the project should continue. And he stood in the center of the circular chamber, with 12 alien species looking down at him. Think of that was true. You did not call me here to build a museum piece, he said, and his voice was steady, even though his hands were not. You called me because this thing scares you, and you do not know why. I do. That's the whole point. The chamber was silent again, and Kale picked up his tools and went back to work. Kale discovered the ghosts on a Tuesday, though the station did not have Tuesdays, and the concept of weekdays meant nothing to anyone but him. But he kept a calendar on the wall of his quarters, because a man needed something to hold on to when he was surrounded by aliens and dead stars and the remains of someone else's war. He had been running a deep-layer molecular scan on the armor's chest plate, the largest surviving piece, and the one that bore the heaviest concentration of dried blood. When the scanner returned data that made no sense at all, because mixed into the crystalline structure of the bioalloy were patterns of electrochemical activity that should not have existed in material that had been dead for 40,000 years. The patterns were faint and irregular, and they pulsed in rhythms that reminded Kale of something he could not immediately place. And then he realized what they reminded him of, and the realization made him push his chair back from their workbench so fast that it toppled over behind him. They were brainwaves, not active thought, nothing so dramatic or so terrifying as a living mind trapped inside ancient metal, but molecular echoes of neural activity that had been imprinted into the bioalloy at the moment of extreme emotional intensity. Like a photograph burned into film by a flash of light too bright to bear. The armor remembered. Kale spent 2 days building an interface using neural mapping technology that humans had originally developed for treating soldiers with severe post-traumatic stress. A system designed to read the faint electrical signatures of traumatic memories stored in human neural tissue and translate them into sensory data that a therapist could observe and help the patient process. And when he connected this interface to the chest plate and closed his eyes, he saw Vreth's last day. It came in fragments, broken and incomplete, like a dream remembered in pieces after waking. But the fragments were enough. He saw a sky the color of burning copper above a landscape of shattered stone, and he felt the weight of the armor on a body that was not his own, with too many limbs and joints that bent in directions his mind could not follow. And the weight was agony, because the armor had been feeding on its wearer for months, and there was almost nothing left to take. He felt Vreth's exhaustion, a tiredness so deep it had become a kind of peace, the way a river stops fighting when it reaches the sea. And he felt the general's 4 hands gripping weapons that had become extensions of the armor itself, fused to the gauntlets by blood and time and the relentless hunger of the bioalloy. And he saw what Vreth was fighting for. Behind the general, behind the line that Vreth held alone, because everyone else was dead or dying, or had already retreated, was the entrance to a tunnel system carved into the bedrock of the planet. Through that entrance, thousands of Valet civilians were moving in a slow and desperate river of bodies, carrying their children and their elders, and nothing else, because there was no time for anything else. Vreth was not attacking. Vreth was standing still, and letting the enemy break against the armor like waves against a cliff. And every impact took something, a piece of a plate, a measure of blood, a fragment of the life that the bioalloy consumed to repair itself. And Vreth held the line anyway, because the tunnel was not yet empty, and the civilians were not yet safe. The last fragment Kale saw before the interface overloaded and shut down was Vreth's face, or what passed for a face on a Valeth, a complex arrangement of mandibles and compound eyes beneath a helmet that had cracked down the middle. And the expression on that alien face was one that Kale recognized instantly, because he had seen it in photographs of human soldiers from every war humanity had ever fought. It was the expression of someone who knew they were going to die and had decided that it was worth it. Kale removed the interface leads from the chest plate with hands that would not stop shaking, and sat on the floor of his laboratory and breathed until the shaking stopped. And then he called archivalist Suyen. The Valith came to the laboratory alone, without guards or aides or any of the diplomatic formality that usually surrounded members of the conclave. And Kale told the archivalist everything he had seen, and Suyen listened without moving. When Kale finished speaking, the laboratory was very quiet. And then Suyen made a sound that the translator could not process, a low clicking that rose and fell in a pattern that Kale understood was the Valith equivalent of a human trying very hard not to cry. Our histories teach us that the warrior caste were beasts, Suyen said at last, and the translator rendered the words in its usual flat tone, could not disguise the fracture underneath them. We are taught that they were driven by rage and hunger for conquest, and that our species nearly destroyed itself because of their savagery. That is why we abolished their memory and their methods and everything they built. We were told it was necessary to ensure it could never happen again. That is not what I saw, Kale said quietly. No, Suyen said, and the clicking sound came again. What you describe is not a beast. What you describe is a guardian. Vreth was the one who ended the war, Kale said, because Leon had sent him additional translations that morning. Fragments of historical text that painted a picture very different from the one the modern Valith told themselves. The records suggest that after the battle at the tunnels, Vreth negotiated a ceasefire with the opposing forces, not from a position of strength, but from a position of sacrifice. Vreth offered to surrender personally in exchange for a permanent end to hostilities, and the offer was accepted, and the ceasefire held long enough for your ancestors to begin the process of cultural transformation that eventually became your current civilization. Suyen stood motionless for a very long time, and then the archivalist reached out with one trembling limb and touched the chest plate of the armor, the first time any living Valith had touched it in thousands of years. And Kale saw something change in those compound eyes, something that looked like a wall coming down. Why would our ancestors erase this? Suyen whispered. Because it is easier to renounce violence if you pretend it was never done by anyone worth remembering, Kale said, and he said it gently because he understood the weight of what Suyen was feeling. The weight of discovering that your entire civilization had built its identity on a lie of omission, that the peace you were so proud of had been purchased by someone your culture had taught you to despise. Suyen withdrew the trembling limb and looked at Kale with an intensity that made the human feel like he was being seen. Truly seen, not as a curiosity or a tool or a representative of a violent species, but as another person who understood what it meant to carry the memory of someone else's pain. The Asuuri have filed a formal motion to have the armor destroyed, Suyen said. They call it a vector of ideological contamination. They say that restoring it will introduce the concept of glorified violence back into galactic culture. There is nothing glorious about this armor, Kale said. There is nothing glorious about a machine that eats you alive while you stand in front of a tunnel full of children and wait to die. That is not glory. That is the opposite of glory. That is just a person doing what has to be done because no one else is left to do it. Suyen looked at the armor one more time, and then the archivalist turned and walked toward the laboratory door and paused. The tribunal will convene in 3 days to decide the armor's fate, Suyen said. You will be asked to speak. I know, Kale said. Speak well, Suyen said, and left. Kale looked at the armor laid out on his table, the chest plate with its cargo of molecular ghosts, the gauntlets still shaped to grip weapons that had turned to dust 10,000 years before the first human learned to make fire. The cracked shoulder plate that bore the mark of the blow that had finally killed Vreth the Undying. And he made a decision. He would not let them destroy it. He would not let them clean it. He would not let them forget. The sabotage happened on the night before the tribunal. Because of course it did. Because the kind of people who destroyed evidence always chose the moment when it would hurt the most. Kale had fallen asleep in the laboratory, something he had been doing more and more often as the work consumed him. And he woke to the sound of his alarm system screaming and the smell of something chemical and wrong, a sharp acidic stench that cut through the filtered air like a blade through paper. He was on his feet before his eyes were fully open, and what he saw in those first seconds of waking would stay with him for the rest of his life. 3 of the armor plates, the left gauntlet, the lower torso section, and one of the secondary shoulder pieces, were dissolving, their surfaces bubbling and hissing as a molecular acid designed specifically to break down bioalloy compounds ate through 40,000 years of history in front of his eyes. Kale did not think. He moved, grabbing the emergency stasis pod from under his workbench, and slamming the remaining plates inside it, and sealing the lid, and activating the temporal suspension field that would freeze every molecule inside the pod in place. And then he turned back to the 3 plates that were already dying, and tried to save them with his bare hands. The acid burned his fingers and his palms, and he did not stop. He grabbed the neutralizing solution from his chemical rack, and poured it over the dissolving plates, and pressed his burned hands against the metal, as if he could hold it together through sheer force of will. But the damage was done, and when the acid finally stopped eating, and the hissing faded to silence, the 3 plates were ruined beyond any restoration he could perform. Kale sat on the floor, cradling his burned hands, and staring at what remained of the gauntlet that had once held Vreth's weapon, and it looked like a dead thing now, porous and gray and crumbling at the end edges, and he felt a rage so cold and so deep that it frightened him, because he had not felt anything like it since the day 20 years ago when a careless museum curator had dropped and shattered a 2,000-year-old Roman gladius that Kale had spent 6 months restoring. The security drones found traces of Asuri crystalline residue on the laboratory's ventilation intake, which was all the evidence anyone needed, but which would never be enough for a formal accusation, because the Asuri were an elder species, and elder species did not commit crimes. They committed cultural interventions, and the distinction made Kale want to break something. The tribunal convened the next morning in the same circular chamber where Kale had first asked his question about the blood, and the 12 platforms were occupied, and the silence was thick and deliberate, and Kale stood in the center, with bandaged hands and a fury in his chest that he kept carefully locked behind his. The Asuri representative spoke first, a crystalline being that refracted light through its body in patterns that served as language for its species, and that the translator converted into words of measured and reasonable concern. And it made its case with the precision of someone who had been rehearsing for days. The artifact in question is a weapon of war, the Asuri said. Its restoration serves no scientific purpose that cannot be achieved through digital reconstruction. Its physical preservation poses an ideological risk to the principles of peace that this conclave was founded to protect. And its continued presence in this station has already caused diplomatic friction among member species. We move for its immediate decommissioning and molecular recycling. The word recycling hit Kale like a fist, because it was such a clean and careful word for what they meant, which was destruction, which was erasure, which was the final and total elimination of a person's sacrifice, so that no one would ever have to feel uncomfortable looking at it. Several other species spoke in support of the motion, the Quellan, who repeated their complaint about the frequency of suffering, the Tasari, who argued on procedural grounds, and 2 others whose names Kale did not bother to remember because their arguments were identical and amounted to the same thing. We are afraid of what this object means and we would prefer it to stop existing. And then it was Kale's turn. He walked to the center of the chamber floor and stood with his bandaged hands at his sides, and looked up at the 12 platforms and the 12 species that represented the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy. And he thought about Vreth, standing alone in front of a tunnel full of children, and he began to speak. "Someone tried to destroy the armor last night," he said, and his voice was calm, in the way that very dangerous things are calm. 3 plates were dissolved by a targeted acid compound delivered through the laboratory ventilation system. I burned my hands trying to save them, and I failed. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it the night before this tribunal, because they wanted to make sure there was less left to argue about. The chamber shifted, a ripple of movement across the platforms as representatives reacted, and the Asuri representatives' light patterns flickered in a way that the translator did not render into words. "I am not here to accuse anyone," Kale continued. "I am here to answer a question that this conclave has been asking since the day you summoned me. And the question is not whether the armor should be restored. The question is why you are so afraid of it." He paused and looked at each platform in turn, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a species that had been burying its dead and building monuments on the graves for 10,000 years. "Every species in this room abandoned war," he said. "You evolved past it, or you outlawed it, or you erased it from your cultures so completely that you cannot even understand the tools anymore. And you look at humans, and you wonder why we have not done the same. I will tell you why." The chamber was so still that the only sound was the hum of the station's systems, and the faint creak of Kale's bandages as he curled his burned fingers into fists. "It is not because we love it," he said. "It is not because we are savages, or because we lack the wisdom to move beyond it. It is because we refuse to pretend it did not make us who we are. You sealed your wars behind walls of shame, and you told your children that violence was an aberration, a sickness, a thing done only by monsters. And then you forgot that the monsters were people." He pointed at the stasis pod that had been brought to the chamber as evidence, the pod that contained everything that was left of Vreth's armor. That armor was not worn by a monster. It was worn by a poet who prayed every day for the war to end. It was worn by a general who stood alone against an army so that children could escape through a tunnel. It was worn by the person who negotiated the ceasefire that allowed your species to become what it is today. And you erased that person from your history, because remembering them meant admitting that your peace was built on someone else's suffering. Kale's voice did not rise. It dropped, became quieter, became the kind of quiet that made everyone in the room lean forward to hear. "Humans do not erase their wars," he said. "We build monuments on top of them, not to celebrate the killing, but to make sure that every generation has to walk past the graves and ask the question that matters: was it worth it? You cannot ask that question if you melt down the evidence. You cannot honor the sacrifice if you deny the person who made it. You cannot have peace that means anything if you bought it with someone's blood and then pretended the blood was never there." The Asuri representative flickered again and spoke. "You would have a species that still practices violence decide how our history is remembered." And before Kale could answer, Archivalist Suyen rose from the Valeth platform, rose physically, standing to full height in a gesture that Kale would later learn was an act of extraordinary cultural significance among the Valeth, reserved for moments of absolute conviction. And Suyen's voice cut through the chamber like the sound of something ancient finally breaking free. "I would let someone who understands the weight of it hold the hammer," Suyen said, and every translator in the room conveyed the words with a clarity that left no space for misinterpretation. That is precisely why they were chosen. The tribunal voted, and it was close, 7-5, but the motion to destroy the bomb armor was defeated, and Kale was authorized to complete the restoration. He walked back to his laboratory with the stasis pod under one arm, and his burned hands throbbing, and the sound of Suyen's words still ringing in his ears. And when he reached his workbench, he set the pod down, and opened it, and looked at what was left of Reth's armor, and whispered 4 words that no one else could hear. "I will finish this." The restoration took Kale 6 more weeks, and during those 6 weeks, he slept an average of 4 hours a night, and lost 7 pounds, and burned through more pairs of gloves than he had used in the previous 5 years of his career combined. And he did not complain about any of it, because the work was the kind of work that justified a life. The 3 damaged plates were the hardest part, because the acid had destroyed their original structure beyond recovery. And for 3 days, Kale sat at his workbench and stared at the empty spaces where the left gauntlet and the lower torso section and the secondary shoulder piece should have been, and tried to figure out how to rebuild something that had been grown from the body of a being who had been dead for 40,000 years. The answer came to him on the 4th day, when he was studying the molecular scans of the surviving plates for the 100th time, and noticed something he had missed before: a repeating pattern in the bioalloy's crystalline lattice that functioned like a genetic code, a set of instructions that told the material how to grow, and where to bond, and what shape to take. And Kale realized that if he could read those instructions, he could use them to cultivate new material that would be structurally identical to the original. It took him 2 weeks to build the growth chamber, and another week to calibrate it, and during that time, Lean sent him the final batch of translations from the armor's interior inscriptions, and one of them was different from the rest. Not a prayer for the war to end, but a message, carved deeper into the metal than anything else, as if Reth had wanted to make sure this one survived. "Let this be the last time," the inscription read. "Let me be the last one, but if I am not, let whoever follows me know what it cost." Kale read those words, and then he read them again, and then he sat with them in silence for a long time, and when he finally went back to work, his hands were steadier than they had been in weeks. The new plates grew slowly in the chamber, crystallizing layer by layer in patterns that matched the original, with a precision that made Kale hold his breath every time he checked the progress. And when they were ready, he removed them with the careful reverence of a man handling something sacred, and began the process of integrating them into the surviving structure. He did not clean the blood. He did not polish the scorch marks. He did not buff out the dent in the right shoulder plate, where something had hit Vreth with enough force to crack the bioalloy and drive fragments of it into the general's body. He restored the armor as it was, as it had been worn, as it had been earned, because that was the job, and that was the promise, and that was the point. The only addition Kale made was on the inside of the chest plate, in the space where the armor would have pressed against Vreth's body, in the place where only someone wearing the armor would ever see. And there he etched the words of Vreth's final inscription in 2 languages, the angular battle script of the ancient Valith, and the simple block letters of English, side by side, so that the message would survive even if one language died. "Let this be the last time. Let me be the last one. But if I am not, let whoever follows me know what it cost." The unveiling ceremony was held in a new wing of the Athenaeum that had been constructed specifically for this purpose, and it was attended by representatives of every species in the conclave, and broadcast across the galactic communication network to an audience that numbered in the billions. Kale stood at the back of the room and watched as the containment field lowered, and the armor was revealed, standing upright on a display mount in the center of the wing, lit by a single overhead light that cast shadows across its surface in a way that made it look almost alive. It was not beautiful, not in the way that the other artifacts in the Athenaeum were beautiful, with their careful preservation and their climate-controlled cases and their gentle lighting designed to make ancient things look timeless and serene, because the armor was none of those things. It was ugly and brutal and scarred, with plates that did not match perfectly because some of them were 40,000 years old, and some of them were 6 weeks old, and the blood was still there, dark and crusted in the joints and the seams, and the places where the bioalloy had bonded with the body of the person it was slowly killing. And the scorch marks were still there, and the cracks were still there, and the dent in the shoulder plate was still there. It looked like what it was, the last thing a person had worn before they died saving people they would never meet. The plaque beside the armor read, "Vreth the Undying, General, Poet, Peacemaker." This armor was not cleaned. It was restored as it was found, as it was worn, as it was earned. Cale had written those words himself, and when he saw them displayed beside the armor, in letters that would last as long as the station itself, he felt something loosen in his chest that he had not realized was tight. Archivalist Suyin walked to the front of the room and stood before the armor, and for a long time the archivalist did nothing but look, compound eyes moving slowly across every plate and every joint and every dark stain, and then Suyin made a sound. It was not the clicking that the translator could not process. It was something else, something that came from deeper inside the Valith's body, a keening that rose and fell like wind through a canyon. And Cale understood with a shock that Suyin was weeping. The translator tried to process the sound, and failed, and tried again, and what it finally produced was a single word repeated over and over: "Remember. Remember." Other Valith in the audience began to join. First one, then three, then a dozen, their keening rising together in a harmony that resonated through the walls of the new wing, and made the light fixtures vibrate, and caused several of the Quellan delegates to change color in response to the emotional frequency that filled the room. It was the first time any living Valith had wept in recorded history, because their culture had classified the act as a primitive response thousands of years ago. And here they were, standing in front of the armor of a general their civilization had tried to erase, and they were weeping because the truth is heavier than forgetting, and they were finally strong enough to hold it. Cale watched from the back of the room with his scarred hands in his pockets, and his eyes burning in a way he would never admit to anyone. And he thought about all the monuments on Earth, the walls covered in names, the fields of white crosses, the eternal flames that burned above tombs of unknown soldiers, and he understood that this was the same thing, that this had always been the same thing, that every species eventually had to decide whether it was brave enough to look at what its wars had cost, and say the name of the person who paid. In the weeks that followed, other species began reaching out to human restoration specialists. Requests came in from the Draymori for help recovering their ancient battle standards, from the Tassari for assistance cataloging their sealed war archives, from a dozen smaller species who had buried their violent pasts so deep that they no longer knew where to dig. And in every case, the request was the same: help us remember what we chose to forget. Cale took some of these jobs, and referred others to colleagues he trusted. And when a galactic journalist asked him during an interview what he would call his line of work, this strange new profession of helping alien civilizations on Earth and face the histories they had spent millennia trying to erase, he thought about it for a long time. He thought about Vreth standing alone in front of a tunnel full of children. He thought about Suyin weeping for the first time in the history of a species. He thought about the blood still in the metal, and the prayer still on the chest plate, and the question he had asked on his first day in the conclave chamber that had started all of this. "Honest work," he said. And somewhere deep inside the Athenaeum Primus, in a wing built to hold one suit of broken and blood-stained and irreplaceable armor, the light fell across a shoulder plate that was still cracked from an impact that would have shattered stone, and the blood of a poet who had died saving strangers caught the light and held it, not shining, not gleaming, not beautiful, just there, just present, just refusing to be forgotten, the way humans had always refused to be forgotten. Way the truth always does, if someone is brave enough to leave it where it falls.